My dear one, something was said in a quiet moment that was never meant to matter this much. It was not supposed to reach you, at least not so soon. But those words have been moving toward you with every passing second. The person you love was sitting with someone they trust deeply, and for one brief moment their voice changed. It grew softer, slower, more careful, as if they were guarding something too precious to expose too quickly. They did not start with your name. They started with silence, and that silence said more than most people ever say with full sentences. Stay with this, because what happened in that conversation was not ordinary at all. Do not skip ahead. The air shifted with a single line, and the person listening knew right away this was not just casual talk. Before your name was ever spoken, emotion had already filled the room. They lowered their eyes first, not because they had nothing to say, but because there was so much inside them they did not know where to begin. Then came one simple question from the listener. Why do they keep returning to your thoughts? For a few long seconds there was no answer, but that pause said everything. The deepest truths do not rush their way out. They rise slowly, especially when they carry this much weight. And when they finally spoke, each word came with care, like those feelings had been growing in silence for a very long time. They said, I cannot fully explain it, but there is something about them that stays with me even while everything else keeps moving. Listen closely to that. Those words were not thrown around lightly. They came after long nights, private thoughts, and feelings that had never been shared with anyone before, and that was only the beginning. The person across from them could see it clearly. Even while speaking, they seemed to be remembering something else. Maybe your voice. Maybe the way you carry yourself, maybe one small detail you never thought anyone would hold on to, yet somehow it became unforgettable inside someone else's heart. Stay with this, because what came next was even more revealing. The listener asked quietly, "Is this serious?" Again, silence filled the space, but this was not the silence of doubt. It was the silence of someone who already knew the answer and was almost afraid of how real it sounded. Then, with quiet honesty, they admitted, "Every time I try to let it go, something pulls me back again." That changed everything. It was no longer about a passing thought or a brief emotion. It became clear these feelings had stayed alive through distance, time, distraction, and even their own attempts to move on. The listener leaned in a little closer. They knew now this was much deeper than it first seemed. Keep listening, because the most powerful part had not arrived yet. Then the person you love began to explain what makes you different. They did not talk about looks. They did not talk about status, timing, or circumstance. Instead, they spoke about the feeling your presence leaves behind after you are gone. They said softly, "Even when they are far away, just thinking about them brings me a peace I cannot explain." Those words stayed in the room. Peace is not a word people use without meaning it. It means your memory reaches parts of them where noise once lived. It means your presence has quietly become part of their inner world. The listener then asked, "If you feel this much, why have you never told them?" This time the answer came faster, because some emotions are too valuable to speak about carelessly. Their response said far more than they intended. Some people do not stay quiet because they are weak. They stay quiet because what they feel is too real to treat lightly. Then came the sentence no one expected. Softly spoken but fully honest, they said, "Sometimes I wonder if they know how much they changed the way I see everything." Read that slowly. This is where the whole story begins to turn. You may never have noticed the exact moment your presence started changing them, but somewhere inside, that moment became permanent. You became more than a memory, more than a passing chapter. You became part of how they think, how they feel, and even how they understand themselves. Do not leave this part, because the next question opened an even deeper door. The listener smiled gently and asked, "Then what is it you are afraid of?" For the first time, their voice fell to almost a whisper. They answered, "What I feel has grown into something much bigger than I expected. That confession carried a strange kind of truth. Bigger than expected means you quietly crossed every line they thought they understood. What started small refused to stay small. And then your name was spoken again. This time, with a tenderness that seemed to change the whole air around them, as if even saying it aloud carried more meaning than they could hide. Stay to the end, because something truly important is still waiting for you. After a slow breath, the listener asked one more question. If they were standing in front of you right now, what would you say? Again, there was silence, but not the kind born from confusion. This silence came from feelings that had stayed locked away for too long. Then, after a deep breath, they answered with simple honesty. I think I would tell them they mean more to me than they could ever imagine. That line did not fade when the conversation moved on. It stayed there. Some truths do not disappear once spoken. They echo because they come from a place in the heart that has waited a long time to be heard. And tonight, those words carry meaning for you too. Not because every mystery gets solved in one conversation, but because the deepest truths usually arrive this way, quietly, unexpectedly, only after someone gets tired of pretending they feel nothing. That confession mattered because repeated thoughts always reveal what the heart cannot release. A person can hide emotions from the world, but it is much harder to silence the thoughts that keep returning. When someone keeps finding their way back to thoughts of you, it often means something unfinished still lives inside them. The listener smiled kindly and asked, "Then why keep all of this hidden?" This time, the answer came almost at once, as if they had already asked themselves the same question many nights before. Because when someone means this much to you, every word feels important. That was not fear speaking. It was care. It was respect for feelings too meaningful to throw around. When someone chooses their words that carefully, it usually means they are trying to protect something they deeply value from being misunderstood. Do not skip this next part, because the deepest reveal had not happened yet. The listener leaned closer and asked, what would surprise them the most if they could hear you right now? And for the first time, there was no hesitation at all. I have spoken more honestly about them here than I ever have anywhere else. That changed the mood completely. Honest words shared in private often carry more weight than anything spoken in public. There was no performance in it, no attempt to impress, no reason to act. They were simply admitting something they could no longer deny. Then another line slipped out, catching even the listener off guard. Sometimes the smallest, most ordinary thing happens in my day, and somehow it reminds me of them. Think about that for a second. When ordinary moments begin pointing back to one person, that person is no longer just a thought. They have become part of the rhythm of your daily life. A song, a phrase, a place, a random moment. Somehow, it all circles back. And that is not something people fake. That is what happens when someone has quietly taken root in your heart. The listener asked softly, "Do you think they would even believe everything you are saying?" After a short pause, they answered, "Probably not, because I have never let them see how deeply all of this has stayed with me." That line explained almost everything. Not every strong emotion announces itself. Some feelings stay hidden because the person carrying them is still trying to understand their own depth. Sometimes silence feels safer than showing a heart that is not ready to be fully seen. And still, despite all of that, the truth found a way into the room. Just before the conversation seemed ready to end, another sentence slipped out, almost like a private thought escaping on its own. If they ever knew everything I have shared today, they would understand why I could never really let them go. Those words hung there. Neither of them rushed to fill the silence, because some truths feel complete exactly as they are. Stay with this, because what happened after that went even deeper. The conversation may have paused, but something inside them had not. Even when it should have been over, their thoughts refused to let the moment end. Instead of walking away right away, they stayed there a few seconds longer, as if one final truth was still waiting underneath everything already said. The listener noticed but chose not to interrupt. Sometimes silence becomes the safest place for hidden feelings to reveal themselves on their own, and that is exactly what happened. Without another question, they suddenly said, "It is strange." Even when I decide not to think about them anymore, they always find their way back into my mind. There was no preparation in those words, no softening, just clean honesty. The listener turned fully toward them now, realizing this had become one of those rare conversations where someone begins opening the parts of themselves they usually keep hidden. Then, after another heavy pause, they added, "It happens in the middle of normal life, and every time it comes back, it feels even stronger than before." That said everything. Passing thoughts fade, but feelings that return stronger over time usually mean something inside never truly left. A memory that is truly disappearing becomes weaker with time. But when a thought comes back with more force, it often means its roots go far deeper than simple remembrance. Do not skip this next part, because what they admitted after that changed everything once again. The listener asked gently, "When those thoughts return, what comes first? The memory, the feeling, or the question?" There was a brief silence. Then they answered in a low voice, "The feeling." That one word carried enormous meaning. Memories can come by accident. Emotions usually do not. Feelings come back because some part of the heart still knows there is something unfinished. This time they did not say your name right away. Instead, they lowered their gaze, and a faint smile appeared almost without permission. Then, in the softest voice yet, they said, "Some people settle into your mind without ever asking permission." That line stayed in the air. Everyone knows what an ordinary memory feels like. This was not that. They were describing something that arrives on its own and refuses to leave, even while life keeps moving. Stay with me, because something powerful is still ahead. The listener continued softly, "So what happens whenever someone says their name?" This time there was no effort to hide the truth. Everything else fades into the background. That confession revealed more than they probably meant to show. When someone says the world seems to blur, even for a second, it means their attention moves naturally toward the person who matters most in that moment. Then another careful line followed. "I notice little things I never thought I would pay attention to." The listener smiled. "What kind of little things?" After a slow breath, they answered, "The way they speak, certain phrases they use, tiny habits, things most people would never notice." And there it was. Attention always follows importance. People do not remember the smallest details unless those details have quietly become meaningful to them. That is how hidden feelings reveal themselves. Not always through grand confessions, but through the small things someone cannot stop noticing, even when they try to act like none of it matters. The listener said gently, "You sound like someone who has spent much more time thinking about this than you want to admit." For the first time, they did not deny it. They simply said, "Maybe I have thought about it far more than anyone knows." Those words settled heavily between them. Private thoughts often hold more truth than public conversations ever will. What people say out loud is usually only a small part of what they really carry inside. Then another sentence slipped free, almost like it was meant only for themselves. "Sometimes I wonder if they can somehow feel all of this, even though I have never told them." Only someone carrying deep and constant emotion asks a question like that. People do not wonder if another person can feel their hidden heart unless those feelings have become impossible to ignore. Stay until the end, because something remarkable is still ahead. The listener asked one last question before the mood changed again. If they were standing beside you right now and heard everything you have shared, what would be the hardest truth to admit? This time the silence lasted longer. It felt like they were searching for words strong enough to hold the full weight of what lived inside them. Then they answered with complete honesty. that I have been acting like everything is normal while carrying feelings much bigger than I ever expected. That single line quietly explained the whole story. Pretending everything is fine usually means something deep inside has already changed. Carrying more than expected means those emotions grew beyond anything they thought possible. Before leaving, they added one more thought, and what followed gave it even more meaning. The conversation should have ended there. It should have been just another private exchange, but it was not. Because sometimes the truest part of a story is not what someone says while they are still in the room. It is what they do after they think the moment is over. The one you love walked away. Only a few slow steps, then stopped. No one called their name. Nothing blocked their path. They simply froze because their own thoughts had become louder than everything else around them. Do not skip this moment, because what happened in that quiet pause revealed even more than everything they had already said. For a few long seconds, they stood still, staring into the distance as if replaying every word they had just let out. Then, almost too softly to catch, they whispered your name once more. Not for anyone else. Not for the room. Just for themselves. And that moment mattered. People rarely repeat someone's name when they are alone, unless the feelings tied to it are still very much alive. Long after the conversation should have ended, your presence was still moving through their mind. The listener, who had not quite walked away yet, noticed this and asked one final unexpected question. Why do you always become so quiet after talking about them? The question caught them off guard, but this time they did not hide. They answered, because every time I speak honestly about them, I realize how much I have been keeping hidden inside. That changed the meaning of everything before it. It showed that every confession in that room had only been a small window into what they truly carried. The deepest part was still protected beneath the surface. Stay with this, because the next truth held even more weight. The listener paused, then asked gently, "Then what is still left unsaid?" Another silence followed, but it was not empty. It was full of reflection. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, they answered, "Some days I tell myself I am focused on everything else, but before the day ends, even the smallest thing brings them back into my mind." Quiet words, huge meaning. When someone keeps returning to thoughts of you during ordinary moments, you have become far more than memory. You have become part of daily life without even trying. That is not a small thing. That is not temporary. That is what happens when someone has made a lasting home inside another person's inner world. And still, the conversation was not finished. One more truth was waiting just beneath the surface, and when it came, it made everything before it feel even more real. The listener asked softly, "What kinds of small things remind you of them?" This time the answer came quickly, as if those moments had become too familiar to count. A simple phrase, a familiar sound, a certain place, even an ordinary moment that suddenly makes me think of them. That answer carried its own kind of truth. Real connection is not forced. It appears naturally when someone has already taken a lasting place in your heart. Then, for the first time in the whole conversation, a real smile crossed their face. Small, easy to miss, but real. The listener smiled too and asked, "Why are you smiling now?" Even they seemed surprised by their answer. "Because some memories find me before I even try to remember them." That line stayed in the silence. Memories that come on their own usually reveal a connection that lives deeper than conscious thought. Do not skip this part, because what came next became the strongest moment of all. The listener said softly, "You speak as if they changed something important in you." After a slow breath, they answered, "They did, even if they never knew it." Those simple words changed everything. People do not casually admit they have been changed. They only say it when someone has left a mark that time could not erase. Then came another quiet confession, one that left even the listener still for a moment. There are times when I wonder if they understand how naturally my thoughts return to them. Not because I force it, it just happens. That word, naturally, carried more meaning than it seemed. The things that return without effort usually come from the deepest places in us. Stay until the very end, because one final truth was still waiting. The listener asked, if one day they heard every word you said today, what would surprise them most? And this time there was no hesitation at all. I may look quiet on the outside, but inside my thoughts are much louder than anyone knows. That sentence explained everything. Calm on the surface, a storm underneath. People carrying powerful feelings often speak less, not because they feel less, but because ordinary words never seem big enough. Before finally walking away, they offered one last quiet truth, almost like they were speaking to the silence itself. Sometimes the deepest feelings are shown by the things we never say out loud. Those words stayed long after the room fell still. Some truths do not need to be shouted to become unforgettable. And what happened after they were finally alone revealed something even deeper than anything they had been willing to admit while someone else was listening. Because once no eyes were on them, once no questions remained, once the room gave them back their private silence, the truth did not shrink. It grew. That is what matters here. When a feeling is real, it does not disappear when the conversation ends. It becomes louder in the quiet. It shows up in the pauses. It returns in the middle of ordinary life. It waits in small details, in old phrases, in sudden memories, in a name softly spoken when no one else is there to hear it. So if you ever wondered whether you still live somewhere inside their thoughts, listen closely to everything that was revealed. They tried to move on, they tried to let it settle, they tried to act normal, yet your presence kept returning, again and again, in peace, in memory, in silence, in small moments that should have meant nothing, yet somehow led back to you. Keep this with you, because this is the part most people miss. The loudest truth is not always the one spoken first. Sometimes it is the one that keeps finding its way back after everything else is over. And maybe that is what this whole moment was really showing. Not a simple memory, not a brief emotion, but something that stayed, something that deepened, something that kept growing in the quiet until it could no longer hide from itself. And if that is true, then perhaps the real question is no longer whether you ever crossed their mind. Perhaps the real question is how long they have been carrying all of this without letting you see it. Because by the end of that night, one thing was clear. They were not trying to remember you. They were trying to understand why they never truly stopped.